Your Excellency, thank you very much for that excellent presentation and opening up our conference. I failed to mention in my introduction of the Minister that Her Excellency Diazani Alison Madueke is the first ever female Minister of Petroleum Resources in Nigeria, which is the step toward being the first Minister of Energy in OPEC. Now it's my privilege and pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker. James Mulva is one of the most respected leaders in the United States and global energy industry. Under his leadership, Conocophillips has been an active and constructive force in the energy industry. Most impressively, Jim has not been afraid to take a leadership role in the policy area, advocating the enactment of U.S. federal legislation to address climate change and calling for greater utilization of our nation's ample natural gas resources. Jim Mulva graduated from the University of Texas with a bachelor's and master's degree in business administration and finance. He then served our country as a naval officer and then joined Phillips Petroleum in 1973. The rest of the story tells a lot about the man. He transformed Phillips to an international player in the late 1970s by playing an instrumental role in securing financing for the enormous Ekofisk oil field development in Norway, founding a new oil province and transforming virtually the Norwegian economy. Jim then helped Phillips stave off two hostile takeover attempts in the 1980s and then in the 2000s, worked tirelessly to expand Phillips to increase its competitiveness. Under his leadership, Phillips added production in Alaska, built its refinery base, and then in 2002 entered into what turned out to be a clearly advantageous merger with Conoco. Jim has led Conocophillips to be a major natural gas player in the U.S. and Canada and an LNG force in the Asia-Pacific, and built a major business in the Canadian tar sands. He is a great friend of the Baker Institute, and we are truly privileged to have him here with us today to talk about the future of the energy industry and its importance to the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to introduce to you James Mulva, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Conocophillips. Jim.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And Your Excellency, Mrs. Ambassador, or Minister, very pleased to have you in attendance here today. And ladies and gentlemen, so thank you very much for kind introduction, Ambassador. It's been a long, hot summer for the energy industry. It started with the tragic Gulf of Mexico oil spill. Now, Conocophillips was not involved, but we did what we could. We stood down our operations to verify their safety. And to help the response, we provided technical and logistical support. We contributed to local charities and wildlife rescue, and we took a key step to enhance long-term safety and environmental stewardship. We joined the other major companies in forming a new consortium to improve future response capabilities. The spill certainly captured world attention. The major company CEOs testified in Washington. Everyone tracked the response and cleanup, but meanwhile, there are many other key events taking place. The U.S. economy was lagging, unemployment rising, and international competitiveness and job creation certainly became critical issues. Coincidentally, July was the world's second warmest month on record, and 2010 could be the warmest year on record. So this has increased concerns about human-caused climate change. So all these events have assumed vital importance to natural gas producers. First, because we face the development delays due to government policies and understandable public concern. And second, because we know that gas can do much more. It can help better meet U.S. energy needs, drive economic recovery, and enhance environmental stewardship. Gas can be, and should be, a bigger part of the solution. and should be recognized for its clean burning qualities. So, it's time for gas to, quote, get to work with natural gas, unquote. It was just 6 months ago that I said that gas was nature's gift, and that efforts to utilize it were jeopardized by hydrocarbon deniers. These are the people who strongly, very strongly oppose fossil fuels. They don't acknowledge that society still needs these fuels for mobility, food production, warmth, light, and power. In short, requirements for human progress. Fossil fuels really can't be replaced by hitting a switch and hoping that renewable sources come online fast enough. In today's economy, these same opponents are also job deniers. With the best of intentions, they call for creation of so-called green jobs. However, they ignore the 9.2 million current U.S. jobs supported by oil and gas. They endorse policies that could eliminate hundreds of thousands of these jobs, and they overlooked another fact. Prematurely replacing low-cost conventional fuels with expensive green sources could make U.S. industry less competitive. Every job opening at Conocophillips attracts from dozens to hundreds of applicants. These job seekers know that oil and gas are here to stay, and they do provide very good jobs. So we say bring on the green jobs, but in doing so, don't destroy the real jobs we have today in the oil and gas industry. At ConocoPhillips, we believe that all energy sources will be needed for the future, including renewable sources. We're researching them and have produced them. We also acknowledge that greenhouse gas emissions and their link to climate change raise genuine concern. But our business focuses on oil and gas because these are the sources most readily available at reasonable cost to consumers today. We further believe there are 3 key points to remember about gas. First, it's an energy game changer. Second, gas can help drive economic recovery and job creation. Third, the U.S. needs a balanced energy policy, one that enables greater use of gas in the most efficient, productive, and environmentally beneficial ways. So let's talk about gas as an energy game changer. So explaining further, let's begin with the nation's gas potential. Thanks to new shale gas developments, U.S. gas resources now exceed 2,000 trillion cubic feet. Now that's a 100-year supply at current production, or enough for our great-grandchildren and then some. So gas is more than a bridge to the future. It's part of the long-term energy and environmental solution. We also believe that prices will remain reasonable. According to MIT, 60% of U.S. shale gas can be developed for under $6 per 1,000 cubic feet. Now that's often less than conventional gas. MIT projects a marginal new supply cost of only $7, even in the year 2020. Current prices are around $4 an MCF due to the weak economy and rising production. Now that's below replacement costs, so it's not necessarily sustainable. But long-term forecast of $6 to $7 range would be less than gas's cost in some of our recent years. So gas should be very attractive compared to other sources, particularly renewables that require subsidies. Further, we expect less price volatility than in the past thanks to our larger and lower cost resource base. The existing gas infrastructure is another advantage. The pipeline network is growing, with most major markets supplied by multiple producing regions. This reduces potential for regional price volatility. There is also greater reserve storage capacity to meet peak needs. And new LNG gasification terminals have increased the nation's import capacity. It will soon equal nearly 1/3 of daily U.S. gas demand, providing unprecedented redundancy. So this capacity is underutilized, So if the market tightens, more LNG could come in quite quickly. We are less vulnerable to hurricanes and regional disruptions. And that's because more of the production, 85%, is onshore, and increasingly it's spread nationwide. Critics will say that since shale gas requires hydraulic fracturing, it's environmentally risky. The science proves otherwise. And authorities like MIT and Energy Secretary Chu agree that fracturing can be done safely. The risks are manageable if well completions and surface handling of the water are performed properly. And MIT agrees, as does Energy Secretary Chu. Let's look at the second point, driving job creation. Moving to jobs, starting in our own industry. A big offshore drilling rig employs up to 400 people. Each U.S. onshore rig, and there are now more than 1,600 of them, employ up to 30 individuals. On average, each well our company drills here uses 100 tons of domestic steel downhole. Then there are well stimulation and completion services needed, production facilities to design, build, and install, pipelines to lay and maintain, support jobs for transportation, supplies, food, fuel, and utilities, local gas distribution networks, and the list goes on, and contributes to the 9.2 million industry jobs. So let's look at U.S. manufacturing, where 11.6 million people work today, down 40% from 1978. That's due to automation, layoffs, and offshoring of jobs. But the U.S. is still the world's largest manufacturer with 21% of market share. And we now see reshoring, some jobs returning after failing to realize cost savings overseas. As examples, General Electric is bringing back production of energy-saving water heaters, some other appliances. Caterpillar is increasing domestic production of hydraulic excavators. NCR is returning production of automated teller machines. Although more jobs still leave than come back, the difference is shrinking. And wise government policies could accelerate the change, such as stable and supportive tax and regulatory structures. Also, every factory needs energy. So policies that ensure a robust energy supply can provide a national competitive advantage. Few countries can match our gas resources or their low cost. None can match our expertise or our infrastructure, which stands ready to increase deliveries. With 310 million people living in the United States and about 1/5 of the world's economic output, we need a lot of energy. And multiple sources are available, but none match the ability of gas to deliver more energy quickly, cleanly, and efficiently, and thus help drive economic growth. Not coal, which is limited by railroad transmission capacity and emission concerns, and not the renewable sources. These require heavy capital investment, taxpayer subsidies, new infrastructure, and backup power supplies. Natural gas is an overlooked job creation machine, so it's important that we crank it up and step on the accelerator. Third, the need for a balanced energy policy. In the energy debates of recent years, gas has not fared as well as coal and the renewable sources. But Washington may finally be waking up to the abundance of gas and to its clean air and climate benefits. Well, welcome to the party. Both Congress and the administration can help. How? By starting from a blank sheet of paper to develop a comprehensive energy policy, one that allows all sources to compete on the basis of abundance, cost, efficiency, and environmental merit. We don't have that today. Nature has given us a trump card with natural gas. It would win any fair market test, but current policies stack the deck in favor of coal and renewable sources. That's even though gas costs less for power generation on a full cycle basis and is reliable and it's clean. So here are two recommendations. First, level the regulatory playing field. And second, develop a forward-looking vision of how to best use our natural gas gift. For example, we should reconsider renewable electricity standards. These mandate utilities to supply part of their electricity from renewable sources such as wind power. Many U.S. states have mandates, and Washington is considering a national standard. Unfortunately, renewable sources are quite expensive. The University of Texas found that wind power currently costs twice the average electricity price here. So consumers would have to pay more. This is due to higher capital cost and the need for new transmission lines to remote locations, along with the backup power required when the wind doesn't blow. The Baker Institute supports research and development to lower the cost of renewable sources. And we agree, but their use should not be mandated. And ironically, the current mandates may not actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's because mandated wind power will back out more gas-fired power than coal-fired power, even though gas is a low emission source while coal is high. And remember the backup power. If it comes from less efficient sources, the combination will cause more emissions than a combined cycle gas-fired power plant by itself. Neither will the mandates improve domestic energy security. True, wind power is U.S.-based, but so is natural gas. And gas flows round the clock, year-round. So let's not leave U.S. energy policy blowing in the wind. Ideally, a balanced policy would create an attractive investment climate for gas. But oil and gas is a heavily taxed industry through income taxes, lease bonus payments, royalties, and severance taxes. And the administration has targeted us for new taxes. These will hurt our ability to develop new supplies. Further, under a balanced policy, government would weigh the benefits of its actions against their impacts. Take the deep-water drilling moratorium. Its intent was to call a halt to reassess safety, emergency response, and spill cleanup capabilities. We certainly support that. But the long moratorium has cost thousands of jobs, with the exact number under debate. Meanwhile, permitting delays have slowed shallow water drilling, so production will inevitably fall as a result. It's unclear what new regulations will emerge and their impact on energy development and ultimately job creation. Ideally, U.S. energy policy would enable the market to determine how to best use natural gas and thus gain its economic and environmental benefits. It doesn't today. For example, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, many in Washington support the use of compressed natural gas in vehicles. But gas could do more good in the industrial and power sectors. We believe we could get larger reductions in the future by using plug-in hybrid electric and all-electric vehicles. The electricity would come from gas-fired generating plants. So government should grab the bull by the horns. It should offer incentives for manufacturers to replace older, less efficient boilers, equipment, and processes with modern gas-powered technology. And government should encourage more of the nation's electric power generation to switch to clean burning gas. It should provide incentives for utilities to make greater use of their existing gas-fired combined cycle power plants, while at the same time reducing use of older, less efficient coal-fired plants. Average utilization rates of their advanced gas-fired plants are only 42% now, half their optimum. In theory, the switch would cut the power sector's greenhouse gas emissions by 15%. It would also deliver about 1/3 of the Waxman-Markey climate bill's targeted emission reductions for the year 2020. And there is an added benefit: less acid rain and smog, since gas generates very little sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide. Also, new capital investments in generating plants would not be required, a major advantage in this cash-short era. Now, we can take these steps in the manufacturing utility sectors even while the country waits for carbon legislation. which, as you know, is bottled up in Congress. You could call our proposals more digestible, bite-sized climate protection. These are opportunities immediately in front of us. Certainly there would be some challenges, regulatory obstacles to overcome, transmission lines to build, bottlenecks to clear. But with the right incentives, the market can do a great deal. There's plenty of gas available to begin this changeover. The near-term incremental demand would only equal 2 years of projected growth in shale gas production, or it would equal the volume of our proposed Alaska North Slope gas pipeline. So in conclusion, our proposals are consistent with good climate stewardship. They would not preclude progress in energy efficiency or research into other clean energy sources, renewables, nuclear, and clean coal. They would simply use existing resources to improve the country's international competitiveness while addressing climate change. So nature has blessed the United States with abundant resources. Throughout our history, we have used them to drive progress and prosperity. Now we have the gift of natural gas in far greater abundance than once believed possible. It's domestic, it's clean, and capable of fueling economic growth and job creation. We just need wise governmental policies that will encourage investment and resource development and end use. So again, let's get to work with natural gas. So thank you very much for listening to my comments this morning.
Jim Mulva is willing to take a couple of questions from the audience. We have limited time, so I'll open the floor to questions. Just raise your hand and come to the microphone if anyone has a question. And identify yourself. I think you've convinced the audience. I think...
well, whenever you convince the audience, it's time to leave.
It's time to leave. No questions from the audience? Here we have.
Good morning, Mr. Mulva. Thank you very much. I'm Gary Alden with Synovus Energy. I'm your seconded rep here in town. In the vision that you talked about for the government to take, what is your opinion about an independent U.S. Energy Council, kind of like the Fed, that doesn't go with every 2 and 4 year political idea? Appoint people that are there, point them that can have an idea of looking at the future of the market, and they look at it from a long-term standpoint. That would include your ideas on natural gas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's good morning. It's nice to meet you. Synovus is a great partner of ours up in Canada for the oil sands project. I guess my response is we're always very open and willing. Anything that helps in the formation of good dialogue and debate of important public policy issues. That can come in the form of a think tank, certainly the Baker Institute, any form of that we could create, independent group or that really puts the elephant on the table, allows a good public debate of the pros and cons, objectives and whatever, is a good way for us to talk through the issues and hopefully make more and better informed judgments and better policy going forward.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we will adjourn for a 10-minute coffee break, and then it'll be my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stavens. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Amy Myers-Jaffe. I am the director of the Energy Forum. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here again. I think we started out with an amazingly fantastic opening session, and I look forward to our continuation this morning. It's a very great honor for us to have here today Dr. Robert Stavens. I'll tell you a little bit about Dr. Stavens. He's a very important voice in the climate debate. When we were deciding who should be our top climate keynote speaker for the morning, I asked my staff, because being my age, which I'm not going to tell you what it is, because maybe you'd guess something lower, I said, I want to know who your generation reads on the blogs. I want you to tell me who is the top blogger to the younger generation. And they came forward and they said, everybody reads Bob Stavens. So we said, okay, Bob Stavens is the person we want to have. So he is not only speaking to us, he is also speaking to my students, and that makes him very important because global climate change is a long-term problem. Bob is the Albert Pratt Professor of Business and Government at Harvard's Kennedy School. He is the director of Harvard's Environmental Economics program, and he sounds worse. His job sounds worse than me when I list you all the other poor things that this man has to do at Harvard. He is the chairman of the Environment and Natural Resources Faculty Group. He is the director of graduate studies for their doctoral program in public policy and for political economy and government. And he's the co-chair of Harvard Business School's Kennedy School Joint Degree Program. He directs the Harvard Project on International Climate Agreements. He is a University Fellow of Resources for the Future, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, co-editor of the Review of Environmental Economics and Policy, and a member of the Board of Directors of Researchers for the Future. He is a very respected voice in this subject, and we're greatly honored to have him with us today. I introduce Dr. Stavens.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Amy, for that wonderful introduction. I wish that my kids had been here to hear that I am in any sense whatsoever someone that the younger generation listens to. It would improve things tremendously at home if that were the case. So my topic is to talk about the future of climate change policy. I'm an economist, I confess. However, the perspective that I'm going to be taking, as you'll see, is going to be probably more about politics than it is about economics, because although climate change is, you could say, a scientific problem, technologically, to some degree, we know how to deal with it. At least we know what kind of policies to put in place to foster the right kinds of technological developments and changes in the market. The problem is that those policies are very difficult to put in place because of the politics. And I don't mean politics because of the right versus the left, because of some fundamentals about the politics, indeed the international politics, as I will try to argue. So let me start with some basics for anyone who's not familiar with the story. The Kyoto Protocol came into force in February of 2005. Its first commitment period we are now in, 2008 to 2012. The United States signed but did not ratify and will not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. But even if the United States had participated, the direct effect on climate change in terms of actual emissions reductions would have been small to non-existent. On the other hand, it's also true that both the science and the economics point to the need for a credible international approach. And I emphasize the word international. And that's because of a very important, simple scientific reality about global climate change that differentiates it from almost every other environmental problem I've ever dealt with. And that is the greenhouse gases uniformly mix in the atmosphere. So it doesn't matter if that CO2 is ejected from Beijing, London, Houston, or New York. It has the same effect on the planet. That doesn't mean the damages are the same everywhere. Indeed, they'll be concentrated in particular parts of the world. But the greenhouse gases uniformly mix. It doesn't matter where they came from. That means something very important economically and therefore politically. Namely, it means that for any jurisdiction taking action, whether that's the United States, Europe, China, or the state of California, that for any jurisdiction taking action, it incurs all the costs of taking action, but the benefits of it taking action, i.e. reduced damages, are distributed globally. And therefore, that means that it is inevitable that for any jurisdiction, the benefits of taking action will be less than the costs of taking action. even though together the benefits are greater than the costs. And that's what economists refer to as a classic free rider problem. And because of that free rider problem, international cooperation is required. However, as I'll argue, not necessarily global cooperation. So that's my excuse for taking, at least initially with you, very much an international perspective. And we'll start by asking whether or not the Kyoto Protocol can provide the way forward. Now, the protocol has been harshly criticized by economists, including myself, as well as others. The costs are much greater than they need be due to the exclusion of most countries in the world, countries essentially outside of the OECD, the non-industrialized countries, but importantly, excluding some key emerging economies, which we shouldn't think of together with the developing countries. They're in very different circumstances. And I'm talking about China, India, Brazil, Korea, South Africa, and Mexico. And if we're talking about deforestation, we'd throw in Indonesia as well. As a result of leaving out those countries, by conservative estimates, the costs under the Kyoto Protocol for what's achieved are about 4 times what they need to be. Furthermore, the Kyoto Protocol will actually generate trivial climate benefits. It would result, if fully complied with, result in a 5.2% reduction in emissions by the industrialized countries, but a global increase in emissions because of the exclusion of others. And it fails to provide a long-term solution because it has a 5-year time horizon. Furthermore, these short-term targets, despite the fact I said they're not ambitious, they're actually excessively costly for some countries. In fact, we happen to be sitting right now in the country for whom these targets happen to be excessively costly, the United States. And this explains the economics of it, of the Kyoto Protocol, explains why there is a difference in perspective on the Kyoto Protocol between our European friends and allies and the United States. So this is not about former Bush versus Obama or Kerry. It doesn't matter who it is. It's not Republican, Democrat. The United States has not supported the Kyoto Protocol because of the fact that the baseline year is 1990. All reductions are versus where you were in 1990. So the United States has a 7% reduction target, not nearly as ambitious as that 8% reduction target of Europe, right? No, it's actually vastly more ambitious because in the decade of the 1990s, the United States enjoyed 35% economic growth, an unparalleled period of economic growth in U.S. history, 35% increase in gross domestic product. Therefore, energy generation and use went up something like that, not as much because we've been making the economy more energy efficient over time because energy comes at a price. The economy has been decarbonizing on its own over time. But nevertheless, it means that that 7% reduction target, when you look at really what you have to do when you get to 2008 to 2012, for the United States, it looks like having to actually reduce emissions compared with business as usual by something on the order of 20 to 27%, depending upon the amount of economic growth that we have over the ensuing years. So during the decade of the 1990s, Europe didn't have that kind of economic growth, as you recall. Certainly Japan didn't, just the opposite. Nowhere in the world did. Canada even did not. Australia, New Zealand did not. Furthermore, in Europe, there's something else that's important about the year 1990, that baseline year. Remember, everything's relative to then. Well, something took place after the year 1990, right? The greatest event of that entire century, the collapse of the former Soviet Union, the fall of the wall. And what happened was the reunification of Germany. But the targets for 1990 take account of the previous East Germany and West Germany. Now that's all one Germany. And all of that carbon belching, unbelievably Rust Belt, inefficient industry and electricity generation in the former East Germany, which of course closed down. You'll remember the unemployment and the movement of labor. That's all in the baseline for Germany. So they had what the climate cognoscenti refer to as headroom. So they had a target which was actually not as ambitious as what their business as usual was going to be. Furthermore, in the United Kingdom, something happened that again had nothing to do with climate policy. There was the conservative Thatcher government, market-oriented government of Prime Minister Thatcher. Among the things that took place was the privatization of British coal. That, of course, led to change in coal prices, no longer being subsidized, and a movement from coal to natural gas in the United Kingdom, plus, of course, the discovery opening up of North Sea oil and gas, which put the United Kingdom and Germany, two very important economies, obviously, within the EU, on track to be able to compensate for much of southern Europe. Now, having said that, let's be fair, though, the northern European countries, the Scandinavian countries, have taken action, continue to, and have a very strong, some would call it progressive, policy on climate. So the point is that for Europe and the U.S., it's a very, very different picture on the Kyoto Protocol. And for some economies, the U.S. stands out. Although the Kyoto Protocol would accomplish little, it tries to do it too fast. And that's why I've sometimes referred to it as too little, too fast, obviously an unpleasant combination. But whether the Kyoto Protocol was a good first step or a bad first step, in a sense, doesn't matter because everyone agrees that a further step is required. So I'm going to stop being cynical about the past and try to be optimistic about the future and talk about searching for the path going forward for post-2012 when the Kyoto Protocol expires. So I direct an initiative, the Harvard Project on International Climate Agreements, the purpose of which is to help the negotiating countries identify the key design elements of a future international arrangement, not necessarily a top-down agreement, it might be more bottom-up bilaterals, that is scientifically sound, that does the job, that's economically rational, by which we mean approximately cost-effective, and that's politically pragmatic, meaning that the United States Senate, if it were an agreement, could actually ratify it, and that China, India, and those other key countries would participate in increasingly meaningful ways over time. We draw upon research and ideas from leading thinkers around the world, from academia, economists, political scientists, IR experts, legal scholars, but also private industry, NGOs, and governments. And we actually have 35 research initiatives now in Australia, China, Europe, India, Japan, and the United States. Before I leave this, and this will be the end of self-referential work. If you're interested in learning more about this effort or being kept up to date with it, we're essentially a living, breathing reference library, no more. If you give me a business card at the break or at lunch, I'm happy to put you on our list. Now let me go to substance and try to place in perspective these international negotiations which are taking place. In particular, let's think about what happened in Copenhagen. That was in December of 2009, was an international negotiation. And to put it in context, I think about it much the way we think about that cliche about the American baseball season. That is, when some team has lost its first 7 games in April, interview in the locker room, and then the third baseman says, well, let's not get all upset about it. The baseball season is a marathon, not a sprint, which is true, 162 games. Well, it's even more true about climate change policy. It is a marathon, not a sprint. This is not to say it's not important. Marathons are important, but you don't run them the same way as you do a 100-yard dash. Because if you do, you're never going to go the distance. You're not really going to accomplish much. You may have a photo opportunity at the end of the 100 yards, but nothing beyond that. Now, why do I say this? First, scientifically, it is a stock, not a flow environmental problem. It is the amount of greenhouse gases accumulating in the bathtub that matter, and we've got a very slow drain. It doesn't matter the speed that they're coming out of the faucet. It's the stock, the accumulated stock that matters. And that drain is plugged up. So the greenhouse gases have lag times in the atmosphere of decades to centuries. And that means that a long-term perspective is very important. Second, economically, every economic analysis that I'm aware of, except one, suggests that the cost-effective path to achieving any sensible stabilization of the stock of greenhouse gases and eventually bringing it down is one which involves a gradual ramp-up of target severity. Not doing a lot and then going level, but going up very gradually. Why? Because it's a stock problem and you want to avoid rendering large parts of the capital stock prematurely obsolete. I don't want to put in place a policy that is going to make any of us in this room junk our car tomorrow, but we would want a policy that would give each and every one of us an incentive that next time we're going to buy a car, that we're going to buy a car which is quote-unquote more carbon friendly, whatever that may turn out to be in terms of the technologies that are involved. More importantly, though, than the transportation sector is going to be the energy generation sector. So rather than putting in place a policy that closes down coal-fired power plants today, one obviously wants a policy that puts in place an expected time path of future prices for the private sector, such when those investments are made in new capacity that they go in a carbon-friendly direction. And then third, economically, technological change is key. In order to achieve what are the very ambitious targets, we're talking about globally 80% reduction in CO2 equivalent emissions by the middle, not long after the middle of the century. in order to achieve anything like that, massive amounts of technological change are going to be required. And that requires long-term price signals. Obviously, the innovation of new technologies does not take place based upon what the price signals are at this moment, but what the anticipated prices are going to be over the lives of the given technologies. And then fourth, something I've learned from being involved in the international negotiations is that administratively, the creation of durable international institutions is essential. Sometimes we neglect the importance of the administrative component. Probably all of us in this room, with the exception of Steve Johnson, former administrator of EPA, who takes those administrative components seriously. They are extremely important in the international climate dimension. So what this tells me is that international climate negotiations are going to be an ongoing process, much like trade talks. No one thinks that we're going to solve all the trade problems at one moment in time. Rather, it's an ongoing process, not a single task with a clear endpoint. So the bottom line for me, and I had said this before Copenhagen, was that a sensible goal for Copenhagen in December 2009 was progress on a sound foundation for meaningful long-term action, not some notion of immediate success. So what actually happened in Copenhagen? The first, any of you who are there know, the first thing is organizational failure. The one good thing about being at Copenhagen is any other conference you go to for the rest of your life, no matter how problematic it is, it seems wonderful by comparison, because there was organizational failure of unprecedented degree. They gave out 47,000 advanced credentials for people to come and participate, knowing that the Bella Center had a maximum capacity of 15,000 people. So thousands and thousands of people stood outside in the cold rain in Copenhagen, no, not for an hour, but for 8 hours, and then didn't get in. The people who stood in line for 10 hours sometimes did. I was in line with a member of the Chinese delegation, which was not a way to warm his heart towards effective participation. There was also political grandstanding, and there was a lack of consensus. But at the last minute, quite remarkably, there were direct negotiations among key national leaders. And before I comment on that, I should, for those of you who don't know, the way international agreements are normally established, whether it's human rights, international trade, disarmament, or environment, is that over a gradual period of time, over the preceding 2 years, it's people at the staff level in the various departments, agencies, and ministries around the world. They're doing all the work. They're putting together the agreement. And then at the last minute, it gets up maybe to deputy minister, might get up to a minister, might get up to the EPA administrator, the Secretary of Energy in the United States. And then, if it's really important, for the actual signing, maybe the heads of state come to pose. Okay? That's the way it's normally done. That process failed in the case of the international negotiations. So the negotiators over a 2-year period, going back to Bali, where the negotiations had been before, were unable to write a negotiating text. And then when the ministers came for the ministerial sessions, and that was the U.S. Secretary of State, of course, came for 3 days, they were unable to. So President Obama lands in the airport on Friday morning at about 7:30 a.m. And although I was not in the plane, so this is not inside story, but he was essentially told that, Mr. President, there's no agreement, the talks are going to collapse. For the second time in 2 months, it looks like you're going to have to fly home from Copenhagen with a failure. The first one being when he didn't get the Olympic Games for Chicago. Remarkably, he got off the plane, and I'm pretty bipartisan. I've worked with White Houses on both sides of the aisle, so I'm not pumping any particular party or president. But remarkably, he got off the plane and pushed to get into direct negotiations with the heads of state of China, India, Brazil, and South Africa, the key countries. The Europeans didn't particularly like this, as you can imagine, but they were already on board. When you pre-commit, you don't have a lot of negotiating strength, right? And they pre-committed. So they got involved in negotiations. It's virtually unprecedented, unless you go back to Versailles, it's virtually unprecedented for heads of state to be doing serious negotiation. You could correctly say, well, that's a failure of the process. That's true. But it's also true that they saved the 15th Conference of the Parties, COP15, from complete collapse. And they produced what I would characterize as a significant political framework, the Copenhagen Accord. The Accord addresses two of the key deficiencies of the Kyoto Protocol. One is that that expands the coalition of meaningful commitments to include all the major emitters, including that list of countries I've been giving you. And it extends the time frame of action. It looks out to the year 2050. However, without going into detail about the Copenhagen Accord at this point, something that's obvious is that the U.S. position and U.S. policy is going to be crucial. The U.S. is the second largest emitter after China in the world, and for many years was the largest emitter. So, therefore, I want to turn to U.S. climate policy, and then at the end come back just very briefly of how U.S. politics fit into this international process. So what are the options in the United States? Well, there are two options for national policy. One is obviously federal policy out of Washington, but the other is what I'm labeling as subnational policy at the regional, state, or local level. Under federal policy, the two possibilities are carbon pricing, and then a host of other regulatory approaches. Under carbon pricing, we have two possibilities: cap and trade, which was considered and defeated in Washington, and carbon taxes, which weren't even really considered. And then under other instruments, there are a whole set of ways going forward. I'm going to comment on some of these. And then under subnational policies, I'm going to say a few words about what's happening in California and the Northeast. So with regards to pricing instruments, cap and trade, what are the merits of this approach? Well, number one is that it's cost effective, both in the short term, in terms of price signals for right now, for example, the right dispatch in an electrical grid, but also for the long term in terms of giving future signals, expected prices for investment in new capacity. The distribution of these allowances, if given out for free, can be used in a very benign way to build a constituency for support. That's why we've used these going back into the 1980s. We have significant experience. When we phased out lead from gasoline in the United States, we did it with essentially a cap and trade system, saved $250 million per year as a result. And then what's most striking perhaps is of course the SO2 allowance trading program from the George H.W. Bush administration, on which I worked. And that has resulted in a 50% cut in SO2 emissions at a savings of about $1 billion per year on a $3 billion base. And then finally, cap and trade systems can be linked internationally quite easily. Why? Because that's the approach that the other OECD countries seem to be moving towards or have already committed to. But there are also some reasonable concerns. One is that under a cap and trade system, the cost is uncertain. It's essentially you're holding the dog, which is emissions, and the tail starts wagging, and that's the cost of the allowances. There are also fears of market manipulation. I think those are relatively unfounded, but they're understandable given the recession that we've now emerged from and the causes of it. And then politically, of course, it has been successfully demonized as cap and tax by opponents of climate policy. There are a host of pending design issues. If you're interested, we can talk about those. I won't take time. Interestingly, one could ask, do the politics call for a design change or a name change for cap and trade? Because cap and trade has gone from politically correct to politically anathema in the space of 18 months. It's been a breathtaking series of developments in Washington. Well, one possibility that the Senate tried to look at the last minute is a sectoral approach for the electricity sector only, namely because the electricity sector is interested in regulation in this area because they want some certainty in terms of the carbon price going out in the future because they really need to get going with investment in new capacity. This would mean less environmental achievement, and it wouldn't be cost effective because you've got one sector doing something and the others not. However, it could be a politically feasible path to a better future policy, but the attempt for that was made too late. There's also what I think of as a populist approach, and given that there is a wave of populism right now in the United States from both the left and the right, we see it on both sides of the spectrum, in my opinion. One approach is what is referred to as a cap and dividend approach, although I've been teaching this approach as cap and trade for 20 years at Harvard. But it is 100% auction, and then you take all the revenue and you put it in a check to the people, sort of the way they do it with the oil revenues in Alaska. And presumably you mail the check not just once a year, but every month, and every congressman's name goes in the return address. So it becomes politically feasible. So Senators Cantwell and Collins sponsored this approach, the CLEAR Act. So the merits, appearance of fairness, appeals to the populist mood in the country, but the concerns is that the way that act was written, it would achieve very little. It would also be more costly than the other approaches. And surprisingly, even that was not politically feasible, gained very few co-sponsors. Briefly, carbon taxes are very similar in design to cap and trade, as well carbon tax has more in common with a cap and trade system than a difference, even though I bridled every time I heard those references to cap and tax. They're correct, because a cap and trade system is a carbon tax, and at least a well-designed cap and trade system, which would be upstream on the carbon content of the three fossil fuels. There is, however, a tremendous amount of interest in carbon taxes as an alternative. The vast majority of that interest is from academics, mainly from economists. There's also what I've characterized here as phony interest, although maybe we should be more generous, and I'll call it strategic interest, from the opponents of climate action, because they correctly realize that if you're debating a tax instead, then it reduces the probability even further that there will be action. And that's not just been in some sectors of private industry, but it's also certainly true in the government. There are merits of a carbon tax approach compared with cap and trade. That cost uncertainty I talked about, the tail wagging is eliminated. Instead, we have emissions uncertainty. There's a trade-off. And the cost uncertainty can be addressed in a cap and trade system by putting a range, a collar on prices, which is what the most recent legislative proposals would do. It generates auction revenue, which is potentially a very good thing, certainly in times like we're facing now in terms of budget deficits going forward. You can also do that by auctioning the allowances. And a carbon tax is certainly perceived to be more simple. And indeed, if I wanted to explain the basics of either, it would take less time to explain a carbon tax than a cap and trade system. However, when someone says it's going to be simple, take a look at the tax code. And then you wonder, how simple is it really going to turn out to be when it goes through the process? The concerns are that it's actually, even though it's cost effective like a cap and trade system, it's potentially much more costly to the private sector, more costly even than a non-cost effective regulatory approach. And that is because with the carbon tax, the private sector pays not only for its abatement costs, it also pays for the tax on all the residual emissions. Now, in an economic analysis of cost effectiveness, that's what we call a transfer. It's just going from one sector to the other sector. It's going from the private sector to the public sector. So that doesn't even get included in counting costs and benefits in an appropriate regulatory impact analysis, for example. However, if you're in private industry, you say, what do you mean it's a transfer? It's a transfer out of my pocket to yours. So it is a cost. It's very much a cost to private industry, and that's why there is certainly much less interest in taxes from the regulated sector. Also, the taxes don't have this benign mechanism to build political support, which the cap and trade does. It would be more difficult to link internationally, although not impossible. And there's political infeasibility because the opposition in Washington is not just to cap and trade, although that's the phrase du jour, it's rather to any kind of carbon pricing. So to to give a sense of what these policies would bring about, I think this is going to be discussed in detail from the marvelous research that's being done here at the Baker Institute. We're going to be seeing the rest of today and tomorrow. But just to give a very small flavor from some work of my own, these are actually EIA numbers. The important thing that I want you to get from this is that if you put in place a cost-effective policy, meaning the same shadow price on carbon, whether it's a tax, a cap and trade, or a regulatory approach, on all uses, on all generation of carbon dioxide across the economy, and that's the way you get cost effectiveness. It has to be the same carbon price everywhere. That the bulk of the action, at least up to 2030, is in electrical power generation. Okay, so these are emissions reductions relative to baseline, relative to business as usual. See a tremendous amount in the electric power sector, some in the industrial, very little in residential, commercial, and transportation. I made transportation in yellow because, of course, in the United States, that's where the bulk of liquid fuels, petroleum in particular, are going for gasoline. And this is what's cost effective, and that's the way it should be. Now, an environmental advocate looks at that and says, hey, wait, we've got to have some additional regulations to put in the transportation sector. An economist says, no, this is how you achieve the amount you want cost effectively. You want to achieve more, use a carbon price, and the electric power sector will go up, as all of these bars will, even more. Now, to get a little more, slightly more rigorous about that, let me say a few words numerically about the anticipated economic impacts. And in some senses, I'm combining apples and oranges because I'm taking results from the IEA Energy Outlook in 2009 with EIA's analysis of the House legislation, something from the Peterson Institute, and I'm putting together my own analysis I had done for the Brookings Institution project in 2007. And when you do that, the sensible estimates, so this is not by advocates on either extreme, of the cumulative cost of the kind of trajectory that was in the House and the Senate legislation, for example, is about 0.3% to, at most, still less than 1% annually of GDP. Now, whether that's, if I said that in billions of dollars, it's a very big number. So I'm not saying this is a trivial amount, but it's not another, it's not another Great Depression or even Great Recession. The oil market impacts are relatively small, however, so that's what I want to feature. This is essentially a tax on coal, so a cost-effective policy, in other words, a well-designed policy that's good for the economy overall, is essentially going to be a tax on coal. So with the policy that I was talking about, coal prices would increase 280% relative to business as usual by 2030. Essentially, what does that mean? Very much reinforcing, actually, what Mr. Mulva had to say, is that a tremendous movement from coal to natural gas. So as the carbon price goes up, what's the first thing you see of real action? Changes in dispatch from existing coal and existing natural gas. Next thing you see is in terms of retrofitting. Next thing as the carbon price gets higher is investment in new capacity. And it's only when you get up to $75 to $80 or even $100 per ton of CO2, which is beyond the year 2030, that then you begin to see nuclear capacity looking economically attractive. Whether it passes NIMBY problems is another issue, and renewables. And nuclear and renewables come in at about the same point, but there's a lot of action before then. The impact on gasoline prices, an increase of 9%, which is sort of basically lost in the noise of what gasoline price fluctuations are because of international supply and demand conditions by 2030, so 35 cents a gallon. Gasoline demand, given the inelasticity, falling by about 5%. So small action in that sector. So the electricity sector would account for 80 to 90% of the reductions, very small effects in other sectors. The only other sector where you'd have some effects on petroleum industry would be Northeast oil heating, essentially, my part of the country. Oil imports decreased because of overall fall in demand, 9% below business as usual. That's not through some directed policy. However, if all these numbers are for a cost-effective policy, one that uses carbon pricing, if you use a regulatory approach instead, which I'm now going to turn to, it's vastly more costly than this, which is why people, economists anyway, and policy analysts talk about carbon pricing. Well, there is going to be policy, and sometimes our friends in Europe and other parts of the world don't realize that the U.S. is going to have climate policy. We already do. It's in place for mobile sources as of March, and it's going to be in place for January 2nd for all other sources as a result of a U.S. Supreme Court decision in Massachusetts v. EPA and the Obama administration's endangerment finding, meaning that they found under the Clean Air Act that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases pose a threat to public health and welfare. And therefore, that triggers the operation of the Clean Air Act for what are called criteria air pollutants. The mobile source standards we have, the stationary sources come in actually at January 2nd. We won't do it on the 1st. There may be a tailoring rule the administration is trying to put in place to exempt small sources. That may or may not survive challenges in the courts. Interesting, the challenges in the courts are coming from where? On the one hand, they're coming from the Center for Biological Diversity, which is the most activist or furthest left of the important environmental groups on climate in Washington right now, but they're also coming from the right, so the Cato Institute, et cetera. They're also challenging it because they know what? That if you don't exempt those small courses, this is going to really look ridiculous, right? Because it is a ridiculous approach to trying to deal with carbon dioxide, to use the Clean Air Act to do it. This is like, using a hammer to try to, trim your nails. It's going to be painful. Now, there are some merits. It would be effective in some sectors, and the big merit that this administration has talked about, they have argued, this is why they're doing it, is that it's an inducement for the Congress to take action with a better approach. But my argument back to that has always, namely cap and trade, but my argument has always been that's like my trying to convince you to do something, and I say if you don't do it, I'm going to shoot myself in the foot. Because this is going to come back to haunt. That's not a credible threat, right? Unless you really like me. It's not a credible threat. And it's going to come back to haunt because we're going to see the poster child for opposition to climate policy once we regulate really true small business, or God knows if we do backyard barbecues, grills, weed eaters, lawnmowers, et cetera. So what are the concerns? I guess I've already said them. Accomplishes relatively little at relatively high cost. I don't think it'll force the hand of Congress. We've seen that. It may be preempted. Senator Murkowski made an attempt that did not succeed, but now Senator Rockefeller, a Democrat from West Virginia, has a bill that could well pass the Senate, not necessarily the House, and presumably would be vetoed by the President. It's also possible under the, I shouldn't say it's possible, it is true that we are going to have other policies under the Clean Air Act. There are 5 important rules moving through the process in Washington. Any of you who are Washington lobbyists or VPs for environmental health and safety know all about this. And policies that affect SOx, NOx, and mercury, but also for that matter, particulates that affect coal-fired power plants in other ways can actually have the effect of shutting coal plants. In some cases, we've got quite a series of rules that are coming through without being directed at CO2. So I would call that an implicit climate policy. There's a key pending question regarding EPA's use of the Clean Air Act, and it is, may EPA, in other words, legally, create a CO2 cap and trade system or other kind of offset markets to bring down the cost under its existing Clean Air Act authority, even though it's failed in the Congress. And my answer, although I'm not a lawyer, I'm an economist, is probably because there's positive precedent. 1970 emissions trading, which was purely a creature of one office at EPA that went ahead and did that. The 1980s lead phase down, which was also regulatory, not statutory. But the court decision, which invalidated the recent Bush administration's Clean Air Interstate rule because of the cap and trade positions, you know all about this, would also cause one some concern. I think the more important question than may EPA legally do it is can they do it? In other words, politically, given the opposition in Washington so strong to cap and trade, could EPA politically, would they go forward with putting in place a cap and trade system through regulatory authority? And that's just much less clear. That's going to be a political choice. There are also energy policies of a variety of kinds which are not targeted exclusively at climate change. These are essentially a whole set of standards and subsidies of all kinds, a lot of them addressing renewable energy. There's a big discussion right now in Washington immediately on that, but also electricity standards of all kinds. I'm not going to comment on those except to say that the bottom line is that from an economic perspective, carbon pricing is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And some of these would actually therefore help, but not all of them. And the reason is that as I'm going to say, there are other problems that carbon pricing doesn't address. As a substitute for carbon pricing, this suite of policies would do much less and cost much more. It would be terrible news as a substitute. There are other legal mechanisms that are around. There is some public nuisance litigation. If some of you are in the electricity generation industry, you're much too familiar with this. There are lawsuits that are pursuing injunctive relief and or damages. Those are very much in flux because we've got competing court decisions in different federal jurisdictions now. This is essentially common law nuisance litigation. And then there are other interventions to block permits for new fossil energy investments, and sometimes there are efforts to block investments for new renewable energy investments, as in my state of Massachusetts, where an offshore wind farm has faced an ongoing series of hurdles. Some of these are simply NIMBY, local opposition not wanting the plant there, but some of it is probably strategic. So with all of this delay in Washington, attention is now turning to the subnational level. We have in New England the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a cap and trade system in the electricity generation sector only. In California, there is the Global Warming Solutions Act, AB 32, which is very aggressive, and there are a set of others. When and if there is a federal policy, which I think there is going to be at some point, possibly 2013, probably not before then, these will interact with federal policy. And I've recently actually written a paper about that. Some of the interactions are problematic, and some of them are quite benign. If you're interested, we can talk about that later. A question, though, is can there be sensible subnational climate policies if there is an economy-wide federal carbon pricing policy? And I think the answer is yes, around the margins, for those other problems that aren't addressed by the pricing policy itself, and that are really a state and local jurisdiction. But in the absence of meaningful federal action, it turns out in the short term, subnational climate policies could actually become the core of national action. There are some problems, there are some legal obstacles here. It won't be national in scope. It's essentially going to be the blue states, right? It's going to be the Northeast. It's going to be the West Coast. That's essentially what the coalition is going to be, something like that, and maybe some from the Midwest. So it won't be national in scope. It won't be cost effective because it's not national in scope and because there are going to be different carbon prices in different jurisdictions, so it won't be cost effective. Is there a partial solution to that so that I can finish with something positive here? Yes, because these different state and regional markets can be linked. They can just recognize one another's allowances and trade. And if they do that, that will reduce cost, reduce price volatility, leakage of emissions and jobs, and reduce market power. So a possible future for U.S. climate policy is the linkage of state and regional cap and trade becoming the de facto national climate policy. So final slide. To bring this back to where I started, which is the international process, what I've taken you through in terms of the economics and more the politics of U.S. climate policy presents a tremendous challenge to the international process as it exists. We've had this recession and, more importantly, politically high levels of unemployment in the U.S. They're going to be continuing into next year. That makes action extremely difficult, not to say it would have been easy otherwise. We have other domestic policy priorities. First, it was the economic stimulus, then it was the health care bill, then it was financial regulation, now there's immigration reform, and then the Gulf oil spill came along, and all of that put off attention and decreased political will to deal with climate change. Public perceptions, as someone said, are very different in the U.S. than in many other parts of the world. A recent Gallup poll ranked, as it has for years, ranked all kinds of policy issues and asked people what were their priorities, and as my recollection is there were 22 that were listed, and climate change came out number 22, where number 1 is first. The congressional deliberations, the politics, the numbers, particularly in the Senate, are very difficult, but now the numbers are even difficult in the House. The House bill that passed last year wouldn't pass if it were voted on again today. We have U.S. midterm elections, of course, this year coming up. Those work against bipartisanship, not in favor of bipartisanship. But it's not just about Republicans. It's also of Democrats, because the midterm elections make it very difficult for anyone to take any action that is going to have an effect of raising energy prices. And any sensible climate policy is going to raise energy prices. It's either going to do it directly and obviously, or it's going to hide it. But it's going to raise those prices. So my prediction to leave you with is that the negotiations this year in December, which are in Cancun in Mexico, COP16, will probably be more enjoyable, particularly if you stand outside in the line for 8 hours, than they were in Copenhagen, but not necessarily more productive. I rushed through material. I want to suggest that if you'd like to follow up, learn more about any of this, the Harvard Project on International Climate Agreements, our web address, the Harvard Environmental Economics, our web address, and like every other academic in the room, including, I'm sure, Amy, everything that I have written since I was in kindergarten, I have created into a PDF file for you to download from my website. So you can also go there and you can get all sorts of documents, or give me a business card at the break or at lunch, and I'll be happy to keep you up on this. So thank you very much. And so we have time for questions, comments, disagreements. That would be good.
I wanted to go back to the international aspect.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Would you mind saying first who you are and what institution you're with?
My name is Robert Curl. I'm at Rice. This is a question about international aspect. How do you envision cap and trade affecting the exporting of coal from the U.S.?
So the question is, what would be the effect of a cap and trade system, and for that matter, a carbon tax on exports? Well, if nothing was put in place, if you simply put in place the tax and you did nothing about so-called competitiveness effects, then it's going to raise the price of any product going out of the U.S. in terms of its carbon intensity. The approach that was included, and therefore there are all sorts of concerns about competitiveness impacts because of, therefore, you'd anticipate a substantial amount of loss of markets. You would anticipate, even without a loss of markets for exports, you would anticipate a loss of competitiveness and a shifting of carbon-intensive production of goods and services outside of the U.S., right? Particularly to developing countries, where that's been happening anyway as part of a sectoral series of shifts.
You're envisioning cap and trade as somehow or another prohibiting the export of coal?
No, I didn't actually, I apologize, I didn't get to the answer yet. And so I was just describing the problem. And so therefore, what was written into the legislation, there are various ways this can be dealt with, okay? So one way is to make sure that you don't have what you could have then would be, for example, a flood of coal into the U.S., right? I mean, you do that instead, so we use someone else's coal. Any products coming into the U.S., not just fossil fuels, but sort of the bulk commodities, so rolled steel, bulk glass, cement, the bulk commodities that are very carbon intensive would be subject to requirement of holding allowances. So they would have to purchase allowances, an import allowance requirement. Now, the House legislation actually even went beyond that with something even stronger, which a lot of economists are concerned about because of its protectionist aspects. So protection for competitiveness effects of a climate policy, when and if there is a meaningful climate policy in Washington, there is no doubt it will be part of it, because it wouldn't stand a chance politically without it.
You keep talking about imports. What about exports?
So in terms of exports, it's the mirror image. Sorry, I didn't take the time. So on exports, it's the mirror image, is essentially correcting for the tax, so you get back, there's a subsidy.
No, I'm talking about exporting our carbon dioxide by exporting coal.
Right, and so that's exactly the point, is that there is a trade-off, and what the trade-off has to do with is whether or not you want to control the CO2 in each of the countries that are participating, or you want to address the competitiveness, and that is the trade-off on the margin. It's very much there. But under a normal program, what you just described is not going to happen, because with an upstream program, the carbon tax hits all coal. It hits all natural gas, all petroleum.
Well, you seem to favor cap and trade, and so how do you apply cap and trade to the coal mine? Oh,
the same thing. Oh, so either a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, if it's well designed, will not be on CO2 emissions. It's going to be on the carbon content of the three fossil fuels at the mine mouth, the wellhead, and the point of import. That's the way it would be. So it's the carbon content. I'm sorry, I should have said that earlier. Yes?
Hi, Kathleen Cooper. I'm with the Tower Center for Political Studies at SMU. And I have a couple of questions, one very simple. You said at the very beginning that all economic analyses except one seem to indicate that we want to do this slowly over time, and I'm just curious what the one is. And then second question is, you talked about the cost to the economy of getting to, 80% less use by 2050, and the cost was 1% of GDP. I presume that's off the top of our overall GDP. So instead of, say, 3% growth we have every year, it's 1 percentage point lower. Isn't that what you're referring to?
No. So it's two things. So let me do that first, and then I'll answer the first question. It's not that in two ways. One is I'm not talking about a change in the rate of growth. If you look at the change of rate of growth, it's actually in the third decimal point. What it means is that the U.S. economy, this is like the House legislation, in the year 2050, the U.S. economy gets to be where it would have been without policy in terms of the size of the economy about 3 months later than otherwise. So that is a change of the rate of economic growth, but it's a change of economic growth, which is in the third decimal point. So the change that I was referring to is the cost of a fraction of GDP, not of a change of growth, rate of growth of the economy. However, on the other hand, if you're going to 2050, it's a bigger number than I was saying. I was giving, when I made that comment about 0.3 to 0.9% of GDP, that was out to 2030. And as you get more stringent, depending upon what happens with technological change, and none of us know, the models put it 1% of GDP, 1.5% of GDP, but it's always, anything I've seen, it's been below 2. So that's the second question. Your first question was, what was the one exception to economic analysis recommending that the cost-effective or efficient strategy is a gradual ramp-up? And it's the Stern Review, which was led by a very large study that was led by Nicholas Stern, formerly Director of Research at the World Bank, now Sir Nicholas Stern, and now actually Lord Nicholas Stern, who has done a very aggressive review, and in a journal I edit, as well as many other economics journals, on a methodological basis, that work has been heavily criticized, although he's a fine fellow.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Do we have time for one more?
Sir.
Yes, Tyler Burton with Synergy for Energy, Mineral, and Petroleum Law and Policy, University of Dundee. You had mentioned that the Copenhagen Accord had perhaps brought forward a positive sort of framework that we may be able to hang something off of in the future to move forward internationally. I'm wondering, could you elaborate a little bit more on some of the positive aspects, and maybe tie that into how you think it might evolve in Cancun?
So I think the first thing to say about why I was relatively positive about the Copenhagen Accord is that I view it very much, remember this long-term process, it's like trade negotiations, and I view it as a potentially useful step going forward, not in terms of the emissions reductions it would bring about. Okay? And why is it a sensible bridge going forward? Because it accomplished two massively important changes in international negotiations. For the first time, the emerging economies, there are 140 countries in the world which have signed up to it, accounting for 80% of global emissions. And it includes China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, Korea, South Africa. They're on board. That for the first time, those countries are acknowledging their responsibility to participate. Now, did I say that they've signed up to a quantitative target that you or I like? No. But just that step, you can't have dinner unless you come and sit down at the table. That's a tremendous step forward. And the other is going from what was this 5-year negotiation, which is the structure of the Kyoto Protocol, 2008 to 2012, then do it again, then again, to laying out a strategy going out to 2050 eventually. And the reason that's so important is for those reasons I said at the beginning. It's a long-term problem. Private industry needs to have market signals over a long time period to be able to make sensible investment decisions. So it's that change in structure which is so important rather than what it has in terms of the numbers of emissions reductions.
Any ideas about what we might see at Cancun in the lee of it?
So I think what you can anticipate in Cancun is vastly smaller expectations than went into Copenhagen, and therefore fewer stories coming out about what a failure it is. I think there are potential successes, and the biggest success would be we currently have 3 negotiating tracks. A second period for the Kyoto Protocol, which the developing countries want to do, what's termed the LCA, Long-Term Cooperative Action, which is the UN thinking about long-term strategies, and then the Copenhagen Accord. So we've got 3 tracks. If those 3 tracks could be converted to 2 tracks, or better yet 1, coming out, that would be a significant accomplishment. And that would be by the process officially adopting, which it didn't do, it noted it didn't adopt, the Copenhagen Accord. And if I can say a final word, that the reason it didn't, so you have to understand how terrible this problem is, that the United Nations structure under the UN framework, by de facto, it requires unanimity in order to adopt something. So 194 countries have to vote for it. 1 country objects, it doesn't. And in Copenhagen, even though all the major parties agreed to the accord, Sudan, Tuvalu, Cuba, Bolivia, Nicaragua, you see something in common about those countries? And Sudan. So they objected to what they called, this wonderful irony, an undemocratic process. And because of that, it wasn't adopted. So that's the kind of challenge there is going forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, well, our next speaker comes from the West Coast. For us in Texas, that's controversial right there in the start. But we're very excited to have Felix Kramer here. He is the founder of the California Car Initiative, calcars.org. He's an entrepreneur and a committed environmentalist. He focuses on innovation, technology, events, and businesses. He has organized and promoted the idea of plug-in electric cars, even post facto. In other words, maybe at the coffee break or at lunch, you can ask him what you could do with your current car to make it plug in. He has popularized the 100 mile per gallon goal and cleaner, cheaper domestic. I like Tom Friedman's description of him, so I'll read that out. Felix Kramer has made plug-in electric cars not only his passion, but an imminent American reality. Felix?
Thank you. Thank you to the Baker Institute and to Amy for all the important work and for the new report today. Thank you for Robert this morning for a really comprehensive look that leaves us not knowing where we're heading, which is a bit bleak and makes us pretty concerned about what our kids are going to say to us about what we've done with our world and what we're leaving them. I'm going to talk, I'm show about 20 slides. Those will be online at that URL on the side there. And this chart here asks the question I want to ask: what would it take to get transportation half off fossil fuels in 20 years? That's a goal that I'm counterposing to the really encouraging report that came out from the Institute today, which talks about 30% of vehicles being electric by 2050. I do want to distinguish that sometimes we do apples and oranges here. Many of the reports these days talk about not number of vehicles, but how many vehicle miles, what percentage of vehicle miles will be electric. Because we are talking about all electric vehicles, and in other cases, plug-in hybrid vehicles, where part of the miles are electric. So you want to, if you want to put them all in one basket, you have to talk about miles, not vehicles. So. My talk is talking about blue skying. I think we need to talk about our blue skies. We need a blue sky, and we need to talk imaginatively about where we could get, how we can get there. I wrote an op-ed that I hoped would get into the Houston Chronicle. Unfortunately, Thomas Friedman's article about electric vehicles maybe knocked it out. It's in today's Chronicle. It was in yesterday's New York Times. And it talks about whether we're going to regain the lead in electric vehicles or whether China is going to do it. So when I talk about blue skying, and in this column, which you'll be able to see in a couple of days at calcars.org, I want to imagine a world where that Houston ship channel, where no one wants to live near it, which is a global target for terrorism, could someday become a recreational destination. That seems absurd on its face, but it's worth talking about. It's worth trying to figure that out. So let's start by why do any of this? Why think about electric vehicles? 3 reasons: cleaner, cheaper, domestic. And that's the starting point. Your miles are a quarter the cost. That's not talking about the first cost of the vehicles. On the national grid, you're half the CO2. And my favorite thing people say about plug-in vehicles is they get cleaner as they get older because the grid will get cleaner. If the grid doesn't get cleaner, then we're all sunk. It's domestic. We use a variety of different fuels for making electricity, but petroleum is really one of the smallest. And those 3 characteristics bring along 3 different constituencies. People concerned about the environment, people concerned about economic growth and changing to a new clean economy, and energy security. So we have every reason to do this for any number of those reasons. We're a nonprofit startup in a Silicon Valley tradition. We did the first conversion of a Prius in 2004. That's my car in the middle there. I'm the world's first consumer owner of a plug-in hybrid. It took us 8 years to do this. Now we've declared victory this year because the cars are coming. It took quite a broad coalition. That comment from former CIA Director James Woolsey, I'll read it. A coalition between the tree huggers, the do-gooders, the sod-busters, the cheap hawks, and the evangelicals. That's what it took to get plug-in cars to the market. And you can see two former presidents and two presidential candidates there with plug-in cars. The founders of Google, our car in Washington, one of our cars in Washington, and on the right, the chief engineer of the Chevy Volt meeting with plug-in advocates in California. So this chart started out being really easy to do, and now it's getting harder and harder to keep track of it, and we've kind of given up because every car maker now has basically said we're going to do some kind of plug-in car. The first ones, I'm going to be switching my two cars this year for a Chevy Volt plug-in hybrid and an all-electric Nissan Leaf. They are hitting the market at the end of this year in small numbers, but they are starting to come. Last week, Honda is the last of the car makers to fall in line and say they're going to be doing a plug-in hybrid. And you can see all these different vehicles that are heading there, and you can track these. There are a couple of those websites on the top or ways you can track them. In terms of plug-in hybrids versus electric vehicles, I happen to believe that plug-in hybrids are going to be the main platform for transportation for the next 10 or 20 years, and anything that we can do to improve the internal combustion inside of that is additive to the benefits of the vehicle. But especially in America, people do have range anxiety, and they want to know they're not going to run out of gas. If I turn out to be wrong, and everyone who owns two cars in America realizes that that second car could be a 100-mile range electric vehicle and decides to do it sooner, then we all win. Because the goal, in my opinion, is to electrify as many of those transportation miles as possible. So I said the cars are coming, but not quickly enough. There's no way you can possibly see that slide. What it's basically saying is that the rate of adoption of new plug-in vehicles is going to be so small compared to the vehicles that are on the road now that it won't make a dent for 15 to 20 years in our petroleum consumption. We can be very happy the cars are coming, but it took 10 years for hybrids to reach 2.5–3% of the new cars coming into the market. So we have figured out that basically if you take that rate of adoption and increase it by a factor of 10, then in 15 years, fewer than 20% of the vehicles will be electric. And that's why we're a Silicon Valley organization. We're impatient. We're always looking for the next big thing. We jumped right into that. We got our start by getting attention by converting hybrids to plug-in hybrids, and that was a purely symbolic thing to do. We had no interest in that happening on any scale, because taking a 50-mile-a-gallon vehicle and turning it into 100 is not very is only a symbolic benefit. But taking a 10-mile-a-gallon vehicle and making it a 20 is a lot better. We do it wrong in the United States. Talking about miles per gallon, if you switch it around to gallons per mile, you realize that a 50 to 100 saves a gallon per 100 miles, but 10 to 20 saves 5 gallons per 100 miles. And so it becomes very obvious that the bigger the vehicle, the less efficient the vehicle, the more benefit you have for electrification. So if you just, I can describe these charts here. on the top chart, the red line is plug-in vehicles as a percentage of the existing fleet, reaching this is at a rate 10 times faster than for hybrids. By 2030, we're at 40%. If we if we take let's see. Let's look at the second chart here. If we imagine that we start with new vehicles and instead of only having new vehicles, we convert existing vehicles. You see that top yellow line, and this is in terms of greenhouse gas reductions, and gasoline tracking each other very closely, not in terms of number of vehicles. We get a much more rapid benefit from the introduction of new vehicles. So basically, the 2050 goal is one thing to look at, but the intermediate goal is what we are focusing on. In terms of energy security, if we want to be happy about plug-in vehicles helping to improve our reduce our consumption of petroleum, then the next 10 to 15 years matter. And in terms of greenhouse gases, it takes a long time to change change the direction of a society and of an industrial sector. And the sooner we do it, the easier it is to increase the rate of that change. So if we backload everything to the 2030, 2050 timeframe, we not only don't get those CO2 reductions soon, we don't have that impact on climate change, on petroleum reduction. So there are a lot of numbers out there. The Electrification Coalition, which includes in its members Federal Express, Nissan, Johnson Controls, Kleiner Perkins, they're talking about 40% of the fleet by 2030 and 75% of the vehicle miles being electric by 2040. And we're talking about half of the vehicle miles by 2030, 65% by 2040, and conveniently 80% by 2050, which tracks that goal for greenhouse gas reduction if we do conversions. So you've never heard about this idea. It seems like a bit wacky, but it is starting to gain currency. Here we have Andy Grove, the founder of Intel, at a conference in San Jose in 2008, with Andy Frank on the right, the inventor of the modern plug-in hybrid, and Ali Ahmadi from the Illinois Institute of Technology, the leading power electronics expert, and each of them has a SUV that they converted. And they are basically pointing to this idea. Now, we did what we did so far. We got plug-in hybrids to the market, together with obviously many other people, our allies, and all over, through advocacy and through having a couple of vehicles out there to show what was possible. That got people excited. They went back into Congress and said, why can't we have these vehicles? I see them outside the Congress. This next time, if it's going to happen, it's going to be different. It's going to be companies with solid business models, technologies that are validated, not garage converters, but fully federally approved, and hopefully at some point with the cooperation of the auto industry. And in the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you a couple of alternative technologies. I do want to talk at this point about, once we're now talking about powering vehicles differently, there has been a lot of attention to the idea of powering vehicles with natural gas. T. Boone Pickens spent about $50 million to encourage that idea. I'm really glad that James Mulva this morning pointed out the fact that you're much better off burning that natural gas in a power generation station than in a vehicle. The reason is that an electric motor is 80% efficient and a gasoline engine is 20% efficient. So if you can take that natural gas and put it in a power plant and then run it to a car that's electrical, you're getting that benefit. I do also, in terms of natural gas, want to say that we have this word, and it's called natural, and it's called the clean fuel. In terms of particulate emissions and so forth, it is incredibly clean. But it is still a fossil fuel. And by most estimates, it's around 30% lower in CO2. So if you are powering vehicles by natural gas, or you're increasing in general the use of natural gas as opposed to renewables, you're reducing your use of renewable, your emissions of CO2, but you're not coming anywhere close to using a low or zero CO2 fuel. I do point out that when we are talking about these immense new discoveries of natural gas resources, both in the Marcellus Shale and the tar sands and so forth, these are not uncontroversial. I think we all know that they do involve risks, and they do involve substantial resources to extract, including a lot of water in many cases. And the question is where we're going to get that water from. It's my opinion that we're going to have a global water crisis in the next 10 or 15 years, long before we have a global climate crisis. And just one final point in terms of doing the comparison between natural gas and renewables. In figuring out the cost of renewables, in comparison to natural gas or to any fossil fuel, renewables have the ability to scale and have the cost come down substantially by new technologies. They're not locked in to existing technologies in the same way, and they can potentially be zero carbon. As one example, the issue of backup storage, which is always factored into the cost of intermittent renewables. There are 3 ways you can back up renewable electricity that I don't know if they have been sufficiently factored in. The first is one that a lot of people are paying attention to with vehicles, which is that cars are parked 23 hours a day on the average, and each of those batteries has the ability to store power and provide it back to the power grid under with existing technology. We need some infrastructural changes, but through starting with demand response, turning off charging and turning on charging, but later adding power for peak times, that is a possibility. The second one is that in terms of solar thermal, a lot of the technologies for solar thermal store the power at night. And the last one is geothermal, which is one of the kind of so far really underutilized power sources for baseload capacity. If we have those, and there's been a real underestimation of how possible it is to transfer power from one place to another. Yes, wind is intermittent, but it's windy somewhere most of the time, and people way overestimate what are called wheeling losses, the cost of transmitting power over long distances, especially if we have a much more modernized grid. So just one more thing before we get to the companies. The reason to do this, to look at converting vehicles, is that we underestimate how long our vehicles last. A UPS truck stays on the road for 300,000 miles, during which time it gets 2 drivetrain replacements. So that vehicle, if there's a way to fix it the second time or the third time, that makes a lot of sense. In Japan, they have decided to convert a quarter of their postal fleet to take the existing vehicles and convert them. We understand this about our built environment, but we define our built environment too narrowly. We understand that our homes and our offices and our factories are on the ground for 50 or 100 years, and they need to be fixed. And we have the Homestar program for that. We're putting a lot of resources into that. We don't get that for vehicles, except partly because of the tremendous funds that were spent to lobby on their behalf. We are allocating tens of thousands of dollars to convert vehicles to run on natural gas. Now, obviously don't think that every vehicle in the world can be powered by electricity, even partially by electricity. For long-haul trucks, there's no alternative, and I would love every long-haul truck in America to either be replaced by rail freight, which is the way everyone else in the world delivers freight, or by natural gas. That would be a great idea. So let's go on to some companies. This is a very promising company in Michigan that is basically taking, you can see their Ford F-150, a 15-mile-a-gallon vehicle in the red there. And in the back, I know you have the parking spot here. That's a national chain of parking spots near airplanes. They are taking the drivetrain out of these vehicles and replacing them with a smaller engine and a battery. And the result is 80 to 200% better fuel economy. In many cases, an all-electric range followed by a gasoline range. This is a company that is currently hoping to get a $100 million loan from the Department of Energy. They I believe, are going to take the world by storm in the next 6 months or more or so with contracts from military, corporate customers, and a nationwide installer network to install these vehicles. $25,000 sounds like a lot of money, but if you are a fleet owner who says, okay, am I going to buy a new vehicle or am I going to extend the life of my existing vehicle by spending this money? And if there's your cost per mile goes down by a quarter, and if, very crucially, that vehicle gets the same tax credit as an existing new plug-in vehicle, which at the moment is $7,500, the economics of that whole model change. So the first technology that you can do is you can take out the engine of the vehicle and you can put in you can make it a plug-in hybrid. This vehicle is like a Chevy Volt, a series plug-in hybrid, meaning that it drives on electricity until the electricity is done, and then it goes to gasoline. Here's a vehicle from Canada that takes a SUV, takes everything out, and makes an electric vehicle. And obviously for many fleet applications and many others, that's a very pragmatic solution. Here's Ali Ahmadi in Chicago, the first picture there. 15 mile per gallon plug-in hybrid turns into 30-mile electric range, and then after that it's a hybrid getting 21 miles a gallon. He calculates that in units of 100,000, the selling cost of this vehicle could be under $15,000, and the solution scales up to transit buses. This doesn't change the engine, it just adds components behind the engine. Here's a GM cooperated in converting a Hummer to a plug-in hybrid. Here's a company that's doing a from-the-ground-up new plug-in vehicle. If you've ever heard of Amory Lovins, this is a spin-off from Rocky Mountain Institute. And they're also taking a VW transporter under contract with the military to convert that global vehicle that comes in trucks and vans into plug-in hybrids. And here's the inventor of the plug-in hybrid, Andy Frank, with his technologies. And here's in the future, if the batteries get cheaper and lighter, and we get wheel motors that are light enough so that there's no driving issue, you can start converting passenger vehicles. This is a real kludge here. You would much rather have something that didn't have a bracket to the wheel, but this is where we could head up in the future. So what will it take now to do this? We would need to equalize those tax incentives. We would need a federal program to unearth the best solutions and motivate them. A carbon price is not enough for changing people's transportation decisions. As Robert pointed out, it's adds a trivial amount to your driving costs. But we look at Europe, $7, and China, $5 a gallon. That's what changes things. And if there's any way we can ever get to that in this country, then we'll be really well off. In terms of the petroleum industry, I hope that the petroleum industry will start looking at the best uses for its products and for all of its resources and facilities. They can be doing a lot more on drilling of geothermal. They can sequester petroleum effectively in plastics and other products, fabrics. There's a product called ETFE, which was used for the bird's nest and the water, the aquatic park in Beijing, and it's not a petroleum product, but they're putting it on top of concrete at Masdar, the new green city that they're building in Dubai. The petroleum industry can invent products like that can use petroleum in wholly different ways. In my opinion, I'm very glad that ExxonMobil is investing in battery research. Chevron is investing in renewable biofuels. A California startup is now selling diesel fuel made from algae to the Air Force. And they think it's going to be cost competitive. And I think it's great that Chevron is investing in that technology. There's many other things like that, including the agricultural sector, of different ways to replace pesticides with products that don't end up creating dead zones in our oceans. Lastly, I would encourage anyone in this in the room here who is in the oil industry to encourage their companies to announce that they are not joining with Valero and Tesoro in Proposition 23, which is the attempt to roll back Proposition 32, the Global Climate Solutions Act of California. We think that's very short-sighted, and people in California are now carrying buttons saying, don't let Texas decide California's energy policy. So let's hope that ship channel someday can be a place where we all go for recreational purposes in the future. Let's hope that it doesn't take some catastrophic experiences much worse than anything we've seen so far, like the result of what Tom Friedman calls global weirding, so that we don't suddenly decide we have to act like it's Pearl Harbor. Thank you.